So the next stage for gaming and home consoles is 32-bit graphics. Working Designs already made their agreement with Sega to be a third-party publisher for their system, the Saturn, but Victor Ireland knew that the Sony PlayStation was going to be coming out soon. Also another 32-bit system, also CD-based, and he really wanted to broaden the reach of Working Designs and expand. So he signed on to be a third-party publisher for the Sony PlayStation as well. This was 1995, so the man in charge of overseeing all releases of games and content for the Sony PlayStation was the Executive Vice President of Sony Computer Entertainment America, Mr. Bernard Stolar.
And no game came here to the West and was released on the Sony PlayStation without his approval. And he had some kind of like weird 5-star rating system for games.
It was during this time that Ireland approached Sony about releasing the Arc the Lad series, but Stolar refused the offer, allegedly citing RPGs as being too nerdy in contrast to the cool and edgy image he wanted for the PlayStation. This rebuff would be the beginning of a feud between both parties. Victor Ireland and Bernie Stolar are like night and day. On one hand, you have Bernie Stolar, a man who really understood the business side of the video game industry, and on the other, you have Victor Ireland, a man who really understood the mind of a gamer because he was one.
And this is when the clash of characters started happening. You could say both Bernie and Victor Ireland are polarizing figures in the game world with very strong opinions. Bernie would famously disparage the idea of, 2D RPGs released on the system.
So when Victor Ireland approached him, he basically dismissed the entire genre he was trying to present because it didn't meet his 5-star qualification.
Bernie Stolar was very outspoken about his dislike of RPGs. Aside from him thinking that these were just games that nerds played, he really believed that RPGs were a dying genre.
This would clash with some of the classical 2D Japanese RPG styles that Working Designs gravitated towards and released on consoles.
Rejected but in no way discouraged, Ireland and Working Designs continued to work on bringing niche games over to America on the Sega Saturn. In April of 1996, they would release their first game on the Saturn. So the first game published by Working Designs on the Sega Saturn was actually not an RPG. It was a military strategy game called Iron Storm. And this game was set during World War II. You had to play through major events that happened during World War II as either USA, Japan, or Germany. But one of the things that I remember distinctly about this game was actually on the back of the package that read, if you purchase the game, Working Designs would donate proceeds to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I always thought that that was a very cool gesture on their part. Their next release would come in June of the same year. Shining Wisdom was actually part of Sega's Shining Force series, but it was a little bit different. I would say it was actually more of a spin-off because in the Shining Force series, it was the tactical RPG style of play, whereas in Shining Wisdom, it was the first time that they decided to do the action RPG style of play. And in this game, you take control of a young man named Mars who has to stop the evil ambitions of the Black Elf Pazort, who is trying to take over the world.
Working Designs released Sega's Shining Wisdom, another moment where they had some localization controversies because of liberties that were taken by the Working Designs team in the localization of the game. But again, it can be argued that they were putting the spin on what the content's intent was versus just the transliteration or the translation of the words.
One of the incentives to buy and play Shining Wisdom was a contest that you could enter in to win $10,000. All you had to do was beat the game and then either take a picture or a video of the final status summary screen, send it into Working Designs for a chance to win that $10,000. And in November, what was probably to be their most critically acclaimed game on the Saturn.
This game right here, Dragon Force. What an amazing game.
Dragon Force, another Sega game that Working Designs localized for the Sega Saturn.
To me, this game kind of defied the genre because I didn't know that such a game could exist. A tactical RPG where you could basically see all of your troops in real time just kill each other. It was fantastic. Story was really good too, had great replay value. You could choose from 8 different heroes and they all had their own storylines. Fantastic job.
When Dragon Force came out for the Sega Saturn, I remember it quickly became one of the must-own games on that system. I also remember reading in a lot of the different video game magazines at the time that it won a lot of Game of the Month awards as well as some Game of the Year awards in some of those same publications. But the success of Dragon Force would be bittersweet for Working Designs. By this point, their relationship with Sega had begun to deteriorate due to the market and poor success of the Saturn. As fate would have it, in March of 1997, Bernie Stolar would become the chief operating officer in charge of all North American operations for Sega.
Bernie Stolar left Sony to become an EVP at Sega of America.
So he came over from Sony and he started implementing the same kind of anti-RPG policies at Sega, and that didn't help matters. Not shaken, Working Designs would stay the course with their planned releases for the Sega Saturn. June of 1997 would be a crucial milestone for Working Designs. Their long-awaited debut on the Sony PlayStation would finally come to fruition with the release of Raystorm.
Working Designs created the Spaz label for the release of some more action-oriented titles than their RPG focus on the PlayStation around 1997. This included Raystorm.
Under the Spaz label, Working Designs actually brought this game out, and it was actually the second game in a series in Japan called Layer Section.
Raystorm is a side-scrolling shooter that Working Designs brought over from Japan, and they made some improvements to it. Specifically with the difficulty on the game, they felt that the Japanese version was too easy, so they changed the difficulty on it to make it a little bit more challenging, and they also fixed some compatibility issue with the controls.
Funny thing about this game is it actually wasn't the original game they wanted to release for the PlayStation. They kind of got beat to the punch by Acclaim. Acclaim kind of undercut them, and they released the first game in the series, Ray Force, on the Saturn.
So the name that they would ultimately decide on for its release was actually Galactic Attack. Yes, I know, very original.
So it's kind of funny, you can actually find some interviews where Victor Ireland refers to Acclaim as not very cool in setting them back from their original plans to release the full trilogy on the PlayStation.
However, 1997's E3 later that month saw the souring relationship between Working Designs and Sega reach a new height. Being given only a small corner of booth space by Sega at the show, as well as Stolar's infamous proclamation that the Saturn was not Sega's future, served only to fuel the tension between Ireland and Stolar that much more.
At E3 1997, he had declared, "Saturn is not our future." And instantly you have Bernie Stolar squarely in the camp of where Working Designs was putting most of their efforts.
When Bernie Stolar made his infamous "the Saturn is not our future" comment at E3 97, he essentially gave the system a kiss of death, and he upset a lot of people, publishers, developers, and fans. Especially for the publishers and developers, this to them was a slap in the face because they felt that not only did he not have any faith in what they might still be able to accomplish in the system, he had no confidence. And of course, without that, there wasn't going to be any support.
With those words and with that level of disconnect, and again the feud between Bernie and Victor Ireland, what happened was Working Designs quickly stalled their intent to release Lunar the Silver Star story on the Sega Saturn, and then changed direction and began focusing more directly on Sony PlayStation.
This was very personal. These men did not like each other. Victor Ireland went as far as to say that as long as Bernie Stolar was working at Sega, he would no longer publish games for them. The only thing that Victor Ireland was going to do was finish the projects that he had already committed to on the Saturn. After that, it was going to be all about PlayStation. Despite the E3 debacle, Albert Odyssey was released on the Saturn a month later. Albert Odyssey Legend of Eldian is the only Albert Odyssey game to see a release here in America. Originally it was called Albert Odyssey Gaiden Legend of Eldian, which is Albert Odyssey's side story, And this game was kind of a return to form for Working Designs because it had been a couple years since they had put out an RPG with a menu system and that was turn-based. It's a typical coming-of-age RPG story about a young man named Pike who is an orphan. Evil sweeps the land, he's got to form a party and save the world. A couple of months later in September, the release of Final Fantasy VII changed the landscape of the RPG genre by bringing it more attention than it ever had before.
A sea change took place in 1997 when Final Fantasy VII was released by Square. This was a huge release, and it was hugely successful, and it essentially vindicated the focus Victor Ireland had on the realm of RPGs. It proved Bernie Stolar wrong.
So when Final Fantasy VII came out and completely changed the way the genre was perceived, he had more than a little bit of egg on his face.
Post Final Fantasy VII RPGs became commonplace. They became more mainstream. Prior to that, you were still dealing with a niche market.
Working Designs would end 1997 with 2 releases. In November, Sega Ages, a compilation of classic Sega arcade games for the Saturn. What was cool about Sega Ages is that it came out around the time when compilations weren't as commonplace as they are now. And on top of it, it came with 3 very good arcade ports of games that myself and several other people who used to go to the arcade a lot enjoyed, and that was Afterburner 2, Outrun, and Space Harrier. And in December, a highly anticipated game for the Sony PlayStation. Working Designs fans were craving an action RPG for the PlayStation, and this was one that had been touted for a while. It was the spiritual successor to 1993's Landstalker on the Sega Genesis. I'm talking about Alundra.
Alundra was a really great action RPG like Zelda.
It quickly sold 100,000 copies. Now, that was pretty substantial, and it definitely was riding the coattails of the new care and interest about Japanese-themed RPGs on the PlayStation platform.
Working Design's first taste of success on the Sony PlayStation was definitely Alundra. It sold very well for them, and it was very well received.
The art in the game was really, really interesting, and so were the thematics about religion and the actual method of storytelling. Alundra was a dream walker, and though this might have been explored previously, it wasn't done to the depth that it was in this game. You know, I thought that pretty much all the conventions in an action RPG had already been hit. This game actually proved me wrong and did a couple of new things that I wasn't expecting.
1998's releases would consist of Elemental Gearbolt in August and Thunder Force 5 in November, both for the PlayStation.
Take RPG elements, rail shooter, put them together, what do you get? Elemental Gearbolt.
Another unique example of an underrated classic by Working Designs is Elemental Gearbolt. This was a shooter that utilized the light gun for the PlayStation, that had RPG elements in it, and then on top of it, it was in a science fiction / fantasy setting.
It's definitely a genre breaker, so to speak, and one of the few railgun games available for the PlayStation. Works really well with the gun con. They actually show you a little chart in the manual on which guns work best and which are better in their opinion for the game.
Elemental Gearbolt also did a $10,000 contest with basically the same rules as the Shining Wisdom one. You had to take a picture of the final status summary screen for a chance to win the $10,000. But another one of the prizes that you could win as a first prize was actually the Assassin's Case with the gold gun con.
They had an actual contest where the winners would get a steel case with a gold gun con and a gold memory card along with the game. These are extremely rare to find.
And if you're a collector of all things Working Designs, then this is the holy grail. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe only 40 of these were ever produced. Thunder Force 5, another side-scrolling shooter, originally released in Japan on the Sega Saturn. Then it was ported over to the PlayStation in Japan under the name Thunder Force 5 Perfect System. So that's the name that they actually kept when it was published over here in America, Thunder Force 5 Perfect System. And then finally, after almost 3 years of being delayed, the swan song for Working Designs on the Saturn, Magic Knight Rayearth. Magic Knight Rayearth, of course, is based on the manga and anime of the same name by the group Clamp. Story about 3 schoolgirls that get transported into a fantasy world and have to become the Knights of Prophecy in that world to save it. And this is an action RPG, very quirky action RPG with some puzzle elements.
Magic Knight Rayearth which came out in 1998 and was the last Sega Saturn release in the United States. Now, this was some of what would later become, or had become even, some of the problems with the release of Working Designs games. Extreme delays plagued Working Designs.
Aside from Magic Knight Rayearth being the last game released for the Sega Saturn, it's always going to have that question mark above it. What if the game had come out sooner? What if Bernie Stolar had been a little bit more lenient towards RPGs, if he had had a change of heart when it came to that particular genre? This game could have potentially been a much better seller for Working Designs.
Working Designs almost had to, backwards reverse engineer Magic Knight Rayearth because of programming issues and compiling issues with the game that would delay it until the end of the Saturn's run, making it not a very big seller and not a very good sound investment. Again, Working Designs put a lot of time and effort and capital into the release of games and the production that they wanted to present.
Their 32-bit ventures seemed to be turbulent at times, but in 1999, Working Designs would again reach the pinnacle of success, and it would be thanks, once again, to Lunar.